All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another video with Mr. Kenton for Physical Science. And we're continuing our topic through the periodic table. And today we're going to be looking at classifying elements as either metals, nonmetals, or metalloids, being able to identify where they are on the periodic table, and also being able to identify what are some properties of metals, nonmetals, and metalloids, and what makes them unique. And so you got a pretty, I think, useful kind of colored picture here that I want you to be able to come back to. But as you can see, this is a periodic table with the elements, symbols removed, all that information. And it's color coded, so there's a key here, right? So it's telling us that the boxes that are in yellow are going to correspond to the elements that are metals on the periodic table. And so as you can see, you've got many elements on the periodic table that are metals. The majority of the elements on the periodic table are in fact metals, right? Something to note that I think is important, hydrogen over here, it's element number 1, even though it's in the alkali metals group, it isn't a metal. In fact, it's not even an alkali metal really, it's a non-metal. So just kind of keep that in mind. Now, the purple elements, those are the non-metals, right? So we've got the one element over here, and then the rest of the non-metals are over on the right-hand side of the periodic table, right? And that's going to be something kind of important to recognize as well. And then lastly, the last classification of elements that we have are metalloids. And so you can see here, the metalloids are separating the metals from the nonmetals on the periodic table. Okay, now kind of come back to this graphic. If you need to, screen capture this graphic from the notes or put it in your own notes so that you can take a look at this, because this is an important diagram. This is going to be useful in you being able to quickly classify an element as a metal, nonmetal, or metalloid. Now, what makes something a metal? Now, the metals are located to the left of the staircase. Now, when I say the staircase, I'm referring to this green section of those metalloids. That's the staircase. And notice how everything to the left of the staircase is yellow, so they're metals, right? Now, your metals, what make them metals are the fact that they can conduct heat and electricity very well, and that they want to lose electrons in bonding. Now, some of the physical properties of the metals include the following. Metals have luster, and what that means is that they are shiny, right? Metals are malleable. They can be molded into different shapes. You think about aluminum foil, which is listed over there. Metals are ductile or ductile, right? And that means they can be made into wire. And so here you can see this is a picture of copper wire. They've taken copper metal and they've made it into a wire. Now, for your metals, the majority of the metals, pretty much all of them with the exception of mercury, are solids at room temperature. In terms of their melting and boiling points, so the temperature at which they get converted to liquids and gases is very high, over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, so pretty hot temperatures that are required. And the last thing here, which is important, is that metals are good conductors of heat and electricity. Okay. Next, learning more just a little bit about our metals. The most reactive group of metals can be found farthest to the left on the periodic table and towards the bottom of a group. So as we go from right to left, specifically as we get to the alkali metals, the group 1 metals, they're the most reactive. On top of that, francium is the most reactive metal on the periodic table. That would be element FR, element number 87, most reactive metal. Now, when we say reacting, we talk about its ability to interact with other substances and undergo chemical changes. And so when metals react with other elements, the most likely thing to happen is that the metal is going to lose electrons during a chemical reaction. And so I've kind of posed the question here, do you remember what we call something that loses electrons? We looked at this when we were going over atomic structure. So you think about, do you remember what we call something that loses electrons? Hopefully you've had a chance to think about that. And the answer would be cations. So our metals tend to form cations, okay, because they lose electrons. Now let's take a look at nonmetals. All right, in terms of location on the periodic table, they are to the right of the staircase. Those were those elements that were in purple on the periodic table that was in your notes. Now, what makes something a nonmetal is the fact that it does not conduct electricity well, right? Also that they don't conduct heat well either. Now, here are some physical properties to consider when you start to think about nonmetals, right? So first of all, they're dull in appearance. So they're not shiny. So if you shine light on them, they're not going to reflect the light back at you like metals would. Nonmetals are brittle, which simply means that they break apart easily. You think about with metals, we talked about how you could take a hammer to them, make them into thin sheets, make them into different types of shapes. But for a nonmetal, because they're brittle, they break apart easily. They don't hold their structure when you try to mold them into different shapes, so they're not malleable. Excuse me. Our nonmetals occur mostly as solids and gases at room temperature. They have low melting and boiling points, so that means that the temperature required to convert nonmetals to their liquid or gas phases is significantly lower in comparison to our metals. And lastly, that our nonmetals are poor conductors of heat and electricity. Now, the last thing I want us to take a look at as it pertains to nonmetals is their reactivity. So the most reactive nonmetals are going to be located furthest to the right on the periodic table and towards the top of a group. Now, when we think about, again, that idea of being reactive, we're saying its ability to undergo chemical changes when it interacts with another substance. Now, I've listed that the most reactive nonmetal or most reactive nonmetals are in group 17. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, Mr. Kenton, don't you have the noble gases that are in group 18? Aren't they further to the right? And that's correct. But the noble gases don't react with other elements very often. And so it's actually the nonmetals that are in group 17 that are the most reactive. And so when we take a look at that from that perspective, that means that fluorine is our most reactive nonmetal. So fluorine, element number 9, is our most reactive nonmetal. Now, during chemical reactions, what will happen is that nonmetals will often gain electrons during that particular process. So they will add additional electrons into their valence shell in order to get 8. Now again, kind of want you to recall information that we've looked at previously. Do you remember what we call something that gains electrons? It has a very specific name. Okay, hopefully you had a chance to kind of think through that. And the specific name that we call something that gains electrons is an anion. So our nonmetals will form anions during chemical reactions. Now, our last group of elements that I want us to take a look at are the metalloids. And the metalloids are unique because they have properties of both metals and nonmetals. And if you think about even in the reading that you guys did in class, it talked about how the metalloids could be brittle, and yet at high temperatures, some of the metalloids are really good conductors of electricity. And so our metalloids have some of the physical and chemical properties of both the metals and the nonmetals. Now, these metalloids, those are the elements that are on the staircase or make up the staircase. So those would have been the elements that were in green on our color-coded periodic table. Now, the elements that are metalloids, and I'm pulling this directly from the textbook reading that you guys had to do, should be boron, silicon, germanium, arsenic, antimony, tellurium, and actually that should be it. This should not be astatine. I'll make sure I'll correct this slide in Google Classroom, but it should just go through tellurium, right? So boron, silicon, germanium, arsenic, antimony, and tellurium. Those are the 6 metalloids that you need to be familiar with. And like I've mentioned, they tend to have physical and chemical properties that are similar to both metals and nonmetals. Okay. All right. So the last thing I want you guys to be able to do as we end this video, I want you to just in your notes or on a scratch sheet of paper, I want you to take a look at your periodic table, and I want you to find each of these elements, and they should be very familiar to us. We've been doing a lot of example problems looking at just these 5 elements. And I want you to identify each of those elements as either a metal, nonmetal, or a metalloid. Okay? So how about you pause the video, identify which of those elements are metals, nonmetals, and metalloids, and then check back in here, like pause the video, and then after you've tried that, replay the video or hit play on the video, and you should see me give an explanation of how I came up with my answers. Okay? All right. So hopefully you paused the video and you wrote down your answers, right? And so we need to be able to find each of these elements. So strontium is element number 38. It's in column 2. So that means that strontium is a metal, right? Sodium, element symbol Na, it's in column number 1. It's also a metal. It's not the very first element. It's not hydrogen, so it's a metal. Okay. Next up, we've got nitrogen. Nitrogen is in column 15. Notice that it's on the right-hand side of the periodic table. It's not actually on the staircase, so nitrogen is a non-metal. Okay. Neon is element number 10. It's in column 18, which means it's a non-metal. All right. And then lastly, we've got lead, element symbol Pb. It's in column 14. And based on its location, if you looked at the periodic table, lead is a metal. All right. So there you have it. That's the answer to those problems right there. I hope this was helpful, ladies and gentlemen. I hope that was insightful. Please let me know if you have any questions. Please bring them to class. There's also going to be a Google form that's associated with this video. Please fill out that Google form once you watch the video so I can get some feedback on how you're feeling about this content and maybe any additional questions that you have. Thank you guys so much, and I'll see you again soon.